This is John Thane of Merrill Lynch. Were it not bad enough that the public was forced to internalize the cost of this man's and others' irresponsible actions, but Thane felt compelled to spend $400,000 on chairs and various other office furnishings around the time his business was crumbling around him. And between this and his 2007 compensation of nearly $84 million, I see the need to bring back the ideas of greed and consequent hunger. This consequent hunger is denoted by, or is at least the consequence for many, of the lower flat line. The constant minimum wage since 1990 of $5.15 for workers in the United States. I personally wonder how someone is expected to live on what amounts to about $13,000 per year. Greed is denoted by the upper variable line, which represents the ratio of CEO to worker pay, which currently sits around 411 in the United States. In Canada, the situation is not much different. According to the Financial Post, in 2007, Canada's top 50 CEOs earned 398 times more than the average worker, as compared with 85 times in 1995. Interestingly enough, if minimum wage were indexed to CEO pay in the U.S., workers would be guaranteed to earn around $22 per hour. Another indicator of corruption in countries like Canada, according to Johnson, is found in the connection that exists between private interests and public decision makers. One need only read Jeremy Scales' expose of the American mercenary firm Blackwater, now Zay, to see how well connected private interests are to major political decision makers, both in respect of the revolving door that exists between the private and the public sectors, and in respect of the manner in which the private influences the public. The problem of corruption in a country such as ours can be seen in this diagram, where I depict this interlinkage between cycles of greed and hunger in the private and public sectors. Sometimes, too, these linkages can be subtle, and those involved might not even be aware of how they have become corrupted. Take the case of our university president, who will soon be walking away from the University of Calgary with a $4.5 million supplementary retirement package. This amounts, by my calculation, to about $200 an hour on top of his current wage. I would submit that this excess is indicative of how a cycle of greed and hunger operating in the private sector crosses over into the public sector. I see it working something like this. A hunger for personal wealth in the private sector becomes out of control, resulting in bloated pay packages. This produces hunger in members of the public sector, folks such as our own president. Now, I would underline here that our president might not even be aware of how he's been influenced by private sector greed. At any rate, that hunger becomes out of control, evidencing greed, signaling corruption, though again, I would suggest that this public official is as much a symptom of the problem as he is the source of it. While one could argue that the draining of the university's budget by $4.5 million will lead to actual physical hunger, keep in mind that support staff are currently being laid off here at the university on account of budget shortfalls. One could certainly argue that our president's greed has created a hunger amongst those he leaves for intellectual and moral leadership. From an economic point of view, this hunger for moral leadership is hard to fathom. And this is indeed one reason why public sector organizations need more good budget managers or experienced capital expenditure planners. Solutions. Some ideas as to where to go from here. From my analysis, I see a number of ways of addressing corruption that go beyond privatizing public services, liberalizing trade, or deregulating the economy, or ridding the world of government officials, as suggested by the orthodox view. These are applicable both here in Canada and more broadly elsewhere. First, resources must be put into monitoring the linkages that exist between wealth and power. While it may be a hackneyed term of Lord Acton's, I think it is also appropriate. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Second, while we certainly need better leaders, that is, leaders who are able to control their many hungers, we have to consciously go about creating and building them. We can't somehow assume that there's a market out there that will magically supply them. And this, of course, is a recommendation aimed at any educators in the room and those in a position to support them. I often think we're becoming a vocational institute here rather than an institution grooming the type of people we need to move us out of our own syndrome of corruption. In Calgary, in Canada, and in Alberta, we also need to examine the manner in which political parties are financed. Many complain about Calgary's urban sprawl, but until the ties between the city's development community and its politicians are cut, little will be done about it. Whether or not you're a fan of the political platform of the Alberta Wild Rose Party, you really should take comfort in the fact that we're finally beginning to see a rejuvenation of politics in this province. This is very important. In respect of international corruption, it would further be nice to see such anti-bribery acts, such as the FCPA and the OECD treaty, actually being enforced. I would suggest following the BAE Systems cases. This is the most recent example of how little is being done in this regard. Lastly, for accountants, I would make the simple suggestion that we need to start speaking freely about corruption, treating the term as part of our professional lexicon rather than using polite euphemisms such as fraud, at least when we are talking about it. What we are talking about is more encompassing than that particular act itself. To conclude, first, as we listen to our speakers today, and as you think about corruption, ask yourself, how is corruption being defined? What problems are being identified? What solutions are presupposed by those definitions and problematizations? Also consider, how are we ourselves addressing corruption here at home? And finally, how do our own hungers and those of the people around us, in both the public and private sectors, feed both greed and corruption? Thank you for listening. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free as we have a few minutes.